the response, rather a limited response, from the president at the time when this happened, President Herbert Hoover. And we know that his response was not to do too much. He's oftentimes, it's said that he did absolutely nothing, which is not accurate because he did do some things, but not near as much as what, of course, his successor is going to do. And he certainly probably did more than any other president, any other Congress. There was more action taken in the Hoover administration than had ever been taken before. Yet, because their reaction was still incredibly limited, even though it was much more of a response than he'd ever seen previously, this was such a severe crisis that it did not alleviate the problems. You could argue, though, and a lot of people do argue, that it may have prevented it from getting worse than it was. It might have prevented it from becoming an even worse situation than what it became. But it certainly, of course, did not reverse the trends that were taking place. So when the election of 1932 rolls around, how much of a chance do you think Hoover has at re-election?
None.
Really none. He nevertheless is nominated by the Republicans, so Hoover is going to run as the Republican, and they are running on, partially a platform that, hey, it could have been worse. We did take some action, and things could have gotten worse, and still trying to encourage people, keep your head up. It's going to get better. Things are going to rebound. Things are going to improve. The Democrats, of course, see things completely differently, and they are going to nominate Franklin D. Roosevelt for their candidate for president. He has been from New York. He's the distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, so there is a relation there, both by marriage and otherwise. And like his cousin Teddy Roosevelt, he had served as the Secretary of the Navy, and then later as a politician from New York. But he is chosen by the Democrats to run, and he runs on a much more action, prone kind of approach, that there's going to be more action to combat the problems and the suffering of people in the Great Depression. Roosevelt talks about, or he makes promises to remember what he called the forgotten man. What do you think he meant by the forgotten man? The common man, the people that had probably been hit very hard by this, people that were out of work, factory workers, farm workers, those people maybe that had scrimped and saved and done the things they were supposed to do, and yet found themselves, feeling like there was no way out, feeling like their government didn't care about them, that there was no hope. And he runs on a very optimistic platform in that sense. And that's someone that Roosevelt, people might have assumed Roosevelt wouldn't have identified with. Roosevelt is not exactly the common man. He's a very wealthy individual. He's from an aristocratic family. We already mentioned that he is already related to, presidents and others. His wife comes from a very aristocratic family. But he does have an extreme empathy for the common man, and definitely demonstrates an extreme empathy for those that were suffering so badly in the Depression. And Roosevelt is very open to experimentation. And we'll see him demonstrate that throughout his presidency. He is open to trying whatever. And if that doesn't work, try something else. Now, that makes some people very nervous, and some people just don't like that about Roosevelt. But Roosevelt was not sort of married to a particular ideology or a particular dogma, the way that a lot of other politicians were. He was not going to hold on to strict principles no matter what. He was more, we'll try this, and then we'll try that, and it's a little bit of everything. Thus, we'll see a lot of inconsistencies throughout Roosevelt's programs. But he also was kind of a breath of fresh air to a lot of people, in that he, had that optimism. He seemed to try to reach out to people and say that he was going to try to understand their position. He's just got this charismatic, aura about him, a big smile, and very confident, and all those things. Another thing that may have helped Roosevelt be more appealing to the people, as many of you probably know, Roosevelt was mostly paralyzed due to polio, although there's some research, very interesting, some more modern research suggests it may not have been polio, that it may have been some other that I can't think of the name. It's hard to pronounce that. Guillain-Barré syndrome. You ever heard of that? And it can cause paralysis. Some doctors think, or some medical researchers think today, it may have actually been that and not polio. But never mind. That part doesn't matter. But that was something that had stricken him later in life. One of the reasons some people think it may not have been polio. Polio is typically a disease of children. But that, of course, had paralyzed him. He couldn't walk without braces or without, only short distances, mostly used a wheelchair a lot of the time, although that was generally hidden from the public. You won't see too many photographs of him in wheelchairs, certainly not public photographs. That was something that he's either always sitting or he's standing with assistance or with, wearing braces on his legs, those sorts of things. But that whole incident had probably made Roosevelt, the fact that he had been stricken with that disease, paralyzed, but yet kind of fought back, like insisted that he was going to regain use of his body in some way, that he wasn't going to let that stop him, that had kind of created this compassion in Roosevelt and this sense of determination and sense of, identifying with struggle and having this determination to overcome that struggle, giving him a humility, that he didn't know everything, but he could try this and try that and, try to overcome those kind of problems. A warm-heartedness about him that was quite appealing, particularly to people that were in such despair in the depths of the Great Depression at that time. Roosevelt promises it starts in a campaign speech, and the name just sticks. He says that what America needs and what the American people is a New Deal. And so that's where the phrase, the New Deal, comes from. It came from just sort of a phrase being used, saying we need a New Deal. And that's what's, going to be called, or that's the name that's going to go to his whole program to combat the Great Depression. What we're going to be looking at in this whole chapter is all about the New Deal. But what Roosevelt was, even though he did not have specific plans yet, or at least was not coming forward with exactly what those plans were, Roosevelt is kind of acknowledging, this is an unprecedented crisis, and therefore it is going to take unprecedented action to try to remedy it. That this is going to take more than just raising a tariff or lowering a tariff or something like that. This requires new ideas, a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching this sort of a problem, a new way of approaching the economy, that this is, something that was probably brewing for a long time. And this is going to take long-term planning and long-term goals and, again, new ideas. So he is overall just very committed to change, very committed that there's going to be swift action, big sweeping reforms to combat the problem and also to try to prevent it from ever happening again. So as you've already predicted, Hoover doesn't hardly stand a chance. So, of course, as the result of the election of 1932, Roosevelt wins in a landslide. As you can see here on this map, Hoover only takes a small handful of states. You can see that all the blue there are the states that went to Roosevelt. He wins in a massive landslide. As we said, Hoover didn't stand too much of a chance at all. Now, another point of significance to this election, and it kind of just starts to happen here. It really was already starting to happen a little bit in 1928, and it becomes probably more noticeable by the following one, by 1936, but we're going to go ahead and mention it now. But it's here in the 1930s. It is somewhere between 1932 and 36 that we see a shift in voting patterns, a very significant shift in voting patterns. And this is when African Americans in particularly are going to, and this is always generalizing, but shift support to the Democratic Party. African Americans, which we know numbers of African American voters were particularly limited, especially in the South, but those that did vote were far more likely, and you're not saying that they all did and it was like a rule or something, but the trend was that African American voters were diehard Republican. Why would they associate with the Republican Party?
The Republican Party gave Lincoln was the person who released everyone from slavery.
Yes. Republicans were the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation. And so that had been, the party that supported all the Reconstruction programs and civil rights and all those sorts of things. It is in right here that African Americans start to switch that and start to support the Democratic Party. Again, that is a generalization. But that still holds true largely to this day. Voter trends show larger numbers of African American voters, tending to identify more with the Democratic Party. So this is what, a political scientist would call it, and you might learn about this in government, I don't know, but political scientists would call it a critical election, and they call that political realignment. It's all stuff that political scientists tend to study, but that tends to happen, or starts to happen in this election. So this is a huge victory for Roosevelt. FDR is the initial sometimes people call him, or a good way to abbreviate it in your notes if you want to. And Roosevelt, he wins in November of 1932. He won't take office until March of 1933. So there's still several months while the Depression continues to worsen. Banks continue to close. By the time Roosevelt takes office, probably about 80% of them were closed, if not all the way out of business, but had just shut down so that they wouldn't lose all their money, and people are just panicking. So they're pretty much on the brink of economic collapse when Roosevelt takes office. And when Roosevelt first takes office, and as some of you know, he's going to be in office a long time. Roosevelt will end up being the longest serving president, elected 4 terms, president total, 12 years. So this is just the beginning of a lot of things. Again, he is soon going to begin this set of legislative programs that overall become called the New Deal. Already mentioned that phrase, some of you may have already written that down. Again, the phrase came from some of his campaign speeches promising and suggesting that the United States needed a New Deal. But it comes to be his overall legislative program, his series of new laws, new agencies, job creation programs, all sorts of things to combat the Great Depression, to reverse and to relieve the suffering. A good way to phrase the purposes of the New Deal, and there's so many different kinds of programs, think of it as kind of a umbrella thing, and there's all kinds of laws and programs and agencies that go underneath it. So we're going to be talking about lots of New Deal reforms, New Deal agencies, New Deal laws. The New Deal was, before I get to that, sorry, helping Roosevelt come up with these proposals. Again, Roosevelt wants a new approach. Roosevelt is not married to a particular ideology. He was willing to listen to anybody that had ideas, and he was willing to try just about anything. Again, that will upset a lot of people and bug a lot of folks about, well, bug's not strong enough of a word, but you see what I mean. The Brain Trust, this was a group of advisors that Roosevelt brought together to help him come up with solutions and help him come up with how he ought to go about trying to turn this thing around. How will we get the United States out of this economic recession? How would you reverse that process? How do you help people? How do we get this whole thing moving again? And the Brain Trust were various advisors, economists, different sorts of people to give Roosevelt different advice about that. And they gave him very different advice. There were people in the Brain Trust that said, we need to enforce antitrust laws. That's what we got to do. We got to go after the big businesses because it's all this abuse of power and this abuse of capitalism that has caused us to begin with. We got to enforce and strengthen antitrust laws. There were some that say, no, we got to, get away from those because that's what has hindered business. It's too much regulation, so we need to pull back on some of those things. There are others that say, no, it's not either of those. We need to, initiate, welfare, social welfare programs to get people out of debt, to help people out that are broke, that have no money, that have no job. We've got to initiate spending there to get people back to work and make sure that people are not going to lose their homes, so they won't default on loans, and that's what will get the economy moving again. Roosevelt, being flexible, tries all of those. There's going to be elements of all of that in the New Deal. Again, sometimes it can be quite contradictory, and there are places where we do something and then we decide, no, we don't want to do that, and pull it back. So again, the New Deal doesn't necessarily follow one particular ideology. There's lots of different things, but it definitely follows the ideology that the government had to respond, that it had to react, that it could not just wait for things to get better. The New Deal is framed around what were called the 3 R's. The title of this section, FDR, the 3 R's, sounds like a bedtime story. But the 3 R's These are the things that New Deal programs, whatever they were kind of centered around. Their goals were these 3 R's. The overall goals of the New Deal were these 3 R's. And those 3 R's were relief. So relieve some of that intense suffering. People that could not afford to feed themselves. People that couldn't afford any rent or a house. People that were completely out of work and couldn't find a job. So relief to get people so they were not suffering anymore. Recovery. So the second is recovery. So how do we get the economy to recover? Get businesses back on their feet. Get production up again, because the GDP, that's the gross domestic product, that's the measure of the output that the United States is producing, it had shrunk by like close to 30%, which is quite a lot. Biggest slump I think we've ever seen of it. But anyway, to get that, that gap between production and consumption, to get that back again. And the third R was reform. Reform. So relief, recovery, reform. What's reform mean? Change. Change the system so that this doesn't happen again. Fix the system so we won't end up in such a bad depression, where we will not be so insecure. And there's different ways of combating that, different ways that can be approached. And a lot of the reform-minded stuff won't really kick into kind of this. The New Deal is kind of divided into 2 phases. The first part, what we're looking at today, is what's called the first New Deal. And it more deals with the relief part of things more than anything else. Not to say it doesn't touch on the other ones, but it's, the immediate problems, the ones right there in front of them, were those relief situations. So we will see how all these different reforms and laws revolve around one, or sometimes even more than one, of those 3 R's. Now, the first 100 days, that is the reference to, not exactly the first 100 days, but roughly about the first 3.5, 4 months of Roosevelt's term, because he comes in and then all the stuff just starts getting cranked out. He's got a Democratic Congress that basically just lets him have his way, and it's like, okay, whatever you want, and they're, pretty much passing whatever he is proposing, and also giving Roosevelt a lot of power as the president to handle a lot of this on his own. The New Deal expands presidential power immensely, because while Congress is passing the laws, they are also giving the president a lot of control over how to implement those laws and how to come up with some of the details. Now, Roosevelt has, again, 3, R's, relief, recovery, reform, but there's also kind of 3 things that he wants to address in this, immediately in these first 100 days. One of the first big things he wants to address, usually what's considered kind of number 1 on the list, was the banking crisis. So we're going to look here at the things that he did almost immediately to try to alleviate the banking crisis. And the problem with the banks was they were all shutting down, and people were losing all their money. And if there's no banks, then there's no money in circulation. There's no money available for someone who needs to get a loan for whatever reason. That's part of recovery, is making sure there's capital, there's money out there, money in the system, so people can borrow money to start businesses and all that sort of thing. So solving this banking crisis was crucial. So the first thing that Roosevelt does to try to fix the banking crisis is he declares a national bank holiday. That sounds kind of funny. But what that is he's ordering all the banks to close on a particular day. And a particular day wasn't important, but it's like 2 or 3 days after he was inaugurated, maybe even the next day. But basically ordering the banks to close, everybody shut down, as a means of sort of calming down the panic. Let's shut all the banks down. No banks are open for business. And then we will let the ones, we'll let everybody kind of just chill for a while and not have people going crazy and running to the banks to try to withdraw all their money before it goes under, and not having these runs on banks. And then after that banking holiday, the ones that are solvent, meaning they've got enough money to stay open, those can start reopening. So they just sort of shut it all down and let things calm down. And there's more to it than that. There's a lot of giving the president the power to kind of decide which banks are good to go and which ones are not. So there's your expansion of presidential power. But the national banking holiday, to just let everything kind of calm down and let things recover, and then allow those banks that did have money and could stay solvent to open back up again. Now, this isn't necessarily part of the banking reform, but this is something that Roosevelt starts doing immediately. One of the ways he communicated not just the banking reforms that he was implementing, but all of his reforms, and something he will just continue throughout his entire presidency. Some of you have heard of these before. Roosevelt was a master at public relations, as we might call it, communication, master of the press, uses the press for one of the first presidents to do that to their advantage. One of the ways he did that was through what became called fireside chats. The fireside chats, these were Roosevelt's radio addresses, radio addresses to the public. We talked about the radio and how that was, something that most people had in their homes in these days. So Roosevelt saw this as an asset and saw the press as an asset. That this was a way that he could use to communicate to the American public and tell them about what he was doing and why he was doing it and why they should trust him and why they should go along with it, all those kind of things. So he starts doing that here immediately, telling people this is what we did with bank schemes and here's why we did it and this is what's going to happen, and then encouraging people once the banks opened up that it's okay to put your money there, it's safe, all those sorts of things to encourage people. And this is one of the many things, but he continues to do this throughout his whole presidency, pretty much invents the whole concept of a press conference, really uses the press to his advantage, talking openly with them. This is one of the many things that really kind of endeared FDR very much to the public. This was something, because no president had, if they gave radio addresses, it was very, very formal. And Roosevelt had a way of it really feeling more like a chat, just the president sitting down in your living room with you and talking to you in a way that you could understand, that made people trust him, like him, differently than kind of a much more personable way of doing things that other presidents had done before. Continuing on with banking reform, Roosevelt also removes the United States from the gold standard, at least temporarily, and then eventually forever. The gold standard, meaning money had to be backed up in actual gold pieces. You may recall that the first that Greenback Party and then the Populists had been arguing against the gold standard for a long time. So Roosevelt decides, because there wasn't enough money in circulation, we need to get more money out there to remove the country from the gold standard, to cause inflation and to get more money in circulation. So that was the purpose of that, was to get more money out there by, saying it doesn't have to just be gold because that was too limited and made too short of a money supply, so to increase it there. It wasn't permanent in the moment, but eventually, within, I can't remember what year it happens, but not too long after that, it does become permanent, and the United States hasn't been on the gold standard ever since. Then, probably when it comes to banking, probably the most lasting of banking reforms, other than a removal from the gold standard, I guess you could say, was the creation of FDIC. This is one some of you probably recognize. If you've been to the bank, you've probably seen a sticker like this one, or a sign or something like that one right there on the window. Maybe some of you don't go to the bank anymore. I don't know. People don't go to banks as much as they used to, since that's all online these days. But next time you do happen to go through the bank drive-through or pass by one, you should see this sticker, this logo, this image there in the window somewhere on the door. That stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Remember that one of the big problems here that escalated the Depression was when banks started going under, what happened to people's money? It was lost too. It was as if you had just burned the place down. It was just up in smoke. And so not only did that mean people had lost their money, that meant people no longer trusted banks. That people were scared to put their money in banks. But if there's no money in the bank, then it doesn't work. It's a whole cyclical process. So what the FDIC does is that is government insurance on bank deposits up to a certain amount of money. I think this time it might have been $10,000. Now it's more than that. I can't remember what it is. But what that means is when you put your money in the bank, the government is promising that it is going to still be there when you go to withdraw it. If that bank goes bankrupt, then the government's going to cover you. They're going to promise, those deposits up to a certain amount. If the bank burns down, that your money is safe, that it is insured. So this restores confidence in the banking system, and encouraging people to invest in banks, put their money in banks, and also that's part of reform, keeping something like that from happening in the future. All right, so he's going after banking, trying to alleviate that crisis because that would hopefully prevent this from spiraling out of control even further. Now, another campaign promise for Roosevelt was actually the repeal of prohibition. That was something that he was arguing needed to happen for a number of reasons. One, because it wasn't working and you were just having increased crime and all those things that we talked about, but also that was not helping the Depression. And if you allow alcohol once again, then that's, retail that gets to take place, taxation, stuff like that, it gets things moving. So Congress passes the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, which, as you can imagine, that allows the sale of beer and wine, so not hard liquor, but beer and wine could be sold. So it's not quite a repeal of prohibition, but it's skirting around it, at least at first. And see, that means that can be taxed, it can be regulated, and that could be an economic activity there to produce income and get things moving. And eventually we will see the passage, though, of the 21st Amendment. So the Beer and Wine Revenue Act kind of chipped away at prohibition. The 21st Amendment, what does that do? It repeals the 18th Amendment. 18th Amendment is the only one that's ever been repealed. So with the 21st Amendment, 18th Amendment, no more. Easy to remember. Because this 21st Amendment is they're telling everybody they can drink again. You notice at 21, that's the drinking age, so easy to remember. At 18 is not. Okay, so through this first 100 days, we're seeing this unprecedented action. We've already seen some of it right here. Just trying everything we can to try to fix these problems, to get the economy moving again. Next, we're going to look at ways that the New Deal in these first 100 days, how Roosevelt tries to get the economy moving again by trying to get people back to work, trying to jumpstart things so that people can be getting some income and then be spending and get that consumer economy back working again. So trying to tackle the problem of severe unemployment, which we know was such a big problem. Now, let me back up just a second. The whole thing, of course, is the first is the New Deal. It's really divided kind of into two segments. The first New Deal is what's taking place between 1933 and about 1934. So it's about the first year or so, a little bit more than that, really, of the New Deal. Most of these first New Deal programs, which you could put the banking stuff in that, but most of the first New Deal programs, they were kind of attacking short-term things like unemployment, immediate relief, trying to take care of some of those immediate problems, getting people back to work, making sure people could have money to feed themselves and feed their children, so they didn't lose their house, they could get some kind of housing, all of that. It's mostly focusing on those short-term things, help out the farmers, help out the homeowners, to get people confident again. And there's more programs than the ones we're listing here. The second part of it we'll talk about later, but it was more on the reform end. So this is more about immediate relief kind of stuff. So let's see some of the things that were done to do that. One of the New Deal reforms to tackle unemployment was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. A lot of these New Deal programs, they all have not all of them, but a lot of them have these, they're little, not acronyms, abbreviations, I guess, like FDIC, CCC, there's a bunch of them, WPA, SEC, TVA, SSA, AAA, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Critics even call it the alphabet soup, so it can be a little confusing, but it also helps you not have so many words to say. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, this is an employment program And the idea behind all these employment programs, because there's a couple of them, but the idea behind them is basically, do stuff, enact, undertake projects and do things so that you can pay somebody to do it. So we can employ people to do these projects. The Civilian Conservation Corps specifically employed young men. So they were recruiting young men between the ages of 16 to 21, so guys about your age, and they were doing various jobs related to conservation. So they may have been building parks, fighting forest fires, draining swamps, different things to protect the land and enhance the land, make it more usable, those sorts of things. And these were, again, mostly younger men. They would go and they actually had like Civilian Conservation Corps camps, like barracks where they would live and do their work. And the idea being, pay them a little bit and they can send some of that home to their family, help out with the family's income. And, not just that, but I think for Roosevelt, some of it is, give people a reason to feel good about themselves, give people a reason to hold their head up again. And not feel like they're just down and out and there's no help. So the Civilian Conservation Corps employs millions of people, millions of young men, probably about 3 million or so, doing all these different things, flood control, building bridges, building dams. But even that, though, even though you're putting 3 million young guys to work, that still is only a small percentage of the amount of people that were out of work. So all of these unemployment programs only are able to just take a little dip out of the total unemployment that was such a problem. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, that provided sort of like unemployment insurance. It's not exactly what they call it, but it's basically payments of money relief funds that's going to go to the states, and then the states can use those funds to provide relief for the unemployed. There's some kind of relief for people so they can pay their bills or not lose their house or buy food or something while they are unemployed. So the states can distribute that as they see fit. So once again, you see that the first New Deal is a lot of these immediate relief kind of things, trying to get people some kind of income, some kind of job to at least sort of time over until things get better. Now, again, this only makes a small dent in the unemployment that there was, and so a little bit later in the year, the Civil Works Administration is created, the CWA. This is another job creation program. They employ people to repair highways, build bridges, build schools even, particularly like in some rural areas where they didn't have as many. Even some building airports. There's some of the projects that some of these groups initiated, that some of these groups did. A lot of them are still around. And it employs several million more people. This one does not last really long. Only after a few months, FDR decided to dissolve this one because all this stuff was quite expensive. This amounted to a massive amount of government spending, and that eventually made Roosevelt a little bit nervous about the cost of it, nervous that people were going to get used to having the government provide them with a job, and that would kind of ruin their initiative and things like that. So he eventually pulls back on it. Once again, the New Deal is full of contradictions. Try something and then kind of pull back on it where you don't like it so well. So this one does not last, but it's not the end of job creation programs on the whole. We will see more of them throughout the New Deal, but with a similar idea of build stuff, build dams, build bridges, build buildings, construction, a lot of that, or other kind of improvement projects so that people could have a paycheck and do something with themselves and not be unemployed. Okay, so we will continue we're going to stop right there with that today. We'll look more at the first part of the New Deal tomorrow, how Roosevelt goes about helping farmers and those people that have been hit kind of hardest by the Depression, so big changes there. Before we move into the second New Deal. Questions on any of that? Okay. Got it.